Imagine dedicating your entire childhood to one dream, only to watch it nearly crumble under the weight of devastating injuries. This is the story of a young athlete who turned pain into power, rising from the sidelines to stand on the Olympic podium. It's a journey of sacrifice, resilience, and the relentless pursuit of greatness. Stay tuned to discover how he defied the odds and claimed his place among the world's elite. I don't remember a time in my childhood when I wasn't chasing my father's shadow. To me, he was more than a parent. He was a symbol of everything I wanted to become. A towering figure of discipline, skill, and grit. He had carved his name into the annals of athletic excellence long before I was born. His trophies lined our living room shelves like ancient relics, each one a testament to years of relentless effort. From a young age, I was told I had inherited his gift. But in our household, talent wasn't enough. Life under my father's roof was different from the carefree childhoods I saw around me. While other kids spent their days playing tag or trading toys, I was immersed in training. My father didn't believe in idle time, especially for someone with my potential, as he called it. My earliest memories of kindergartens were marked by a sense of being different. While other kids clambered up jungle gyms or squabbled over crayons, I was already learning discipline. I remember one particular afternoon. The kids were playing a game of soccer. I joined them, laughing as I kicked the ball around, and then I heard his voice. My father, standing by the fence, his expression stern, motioned for me to come. "This isn't your training," he said when we got home. His tone as heavy as a commandment. That evening, I ran drills in the backyard until the sun disappeared and my legs felt like lead. I didn't understand it fully then, but his focus was absolute. My time had to be spent on progress, not play. It isolated me from other kids. They didn't understand why I couldn't join them at birthday parties or stay late after school. I tried explaining it once, only to be met with blank stares and quiet whispers. Over time, I stopped trying. The few friendships I had dwindled, not from lack of affection, but from the sheer absence of time. My world revolved around my father and the routines he meticulously planned for me. Even my relationship with my mother was framed by my father's expectations. She tried to soften his edges, sneaking me treats or letting me skip a run when he wasn't home, but she was as much in awe of his drive as I was. She would say, "Your father just wants you to be great," as though that explained the aching muscles and the exhaustion that followed me like a shadow. Mentally, it was tough. The weight of expectations didn't feel like an honor. It felt like chains. I'd watch other kids run freely and wonder what it would be like to laugh without a clock dictating the minutes. There were nights when I cried silently, staring at the ceiling and wondering if this was what it meant to be special. But I couldn't voice those thoughts. My father wasn't cruel, but he was unyielding. His approval was the only validation I craved, and it came sparingly. A nod after a well-executed sprint, or the briefest smile after a tournament win. Those moments kept me going. The only reprieve I had was my mother's quiet support. She would whisper encouragements as she bandaged my blistered feet or stayed up late sewing patches onto my training clothes. "You're doing so well," she'd say, brushing hair from my sweat-streaked forehead. I clung to those words on the hardest days. They were my reminder that someone saw me beyond the athlete my father was molding. In kindergarten, the isolation began to sink in deeper. I had no stories to share with classmates about TV shows or favorite cartoons because my evenings were spent perfecting my form or working on my endurance. I envied their carefree chatter, their casual friendships. At recess, I sometimes joined their games, but I couldn't commit. My father's voice, not his literal voice, but the idea of him, always lingered in the back of my mind, pulling me away. I wasn't resentful, not then. In my young mind, I thought this was what greatness required. Sacrifice was part of the deal. My father's sacrifices for his career were legendary in our household. Stories told like parables to reinforce the idea that pain was temporary, but glory lasted forever. Looking back, I can see how those early years shaped me in ways I didn't fully comprehend at the time. I learned to endure, to compartmentalize my feelings, and to push through mental fatigue. But I also learned loneliness, the kind that comes from dedicating yourself to a path that few can follow. Those lessons would serve me well in the years to come, though not in the way I expected. By the time I was 7, My days had settled into an unrelenting rhythm of training, school, and preparation for the next challenge. My father's ambitions for me were no longer unspoken. They were laid bare in the structure of every hour I lived. He believed in meticulous planning, a belief he drilled into me with every passing day. Mornings began with runs that stretched for miles, often before the sun had fully risen. By the time other kids my age were rubbing sleep from their eyes, I was drenched in sweat, heart pounding, my lungs burning with effort. This wasn't just exercise. It was indoctrination into a philosophy of sacrifice. The path to greatness, my father said, wasn't paved with idle comfort. He would recount stories of his own struggles, how he rose from nothing to become a professional athlete by sheer willpower and relentless work. You have to build yourself, he'd say, his voice low but firm. Nobody else can do it for you. At that age, I didn't understand the full weight of his words. I only knew that my father expected me to push myself harder every day. On some level, I wanted to meet those expectations. The occasional glimpses of pride in his eyes were worth every grueling session, every aching muscle. Yet, the burden of constant striving began to carve into my psyche. The rare moments when I wasn't training felt strange, almost hollow, as though I were failing by not moving forward. School was little more than an afterthought. My classmates knew me as the kid who always had to leave early or skip group activities. Teachers admired my discipline but worried about my exhaustion. I could see it in their glances, the quiet pity they thought I wouldn't notice. I was rarely invited to birthday parties anymore. The few times I was, my father's voice loomed in my mind. There was always another drill, another session, another goal to hit. If I had the time to attend a party, it was a sign I wasn't working hard enough. Instead of friends, I had my routines. The routines were safe, predictable, and oddly comforting in their repetition. They filled the spaces where normal childhood experiences should have been. After school, I'd go straight to training, my backpack abandoned at the door as I laced up my shoes or prepared for strength work. The physical demands were immense, but the mental toll was subtler and more insidious. Over time, I began to internalize a singular truth. My worth was tied to my performance. If I failed, I wasn't just letting myself down. I was letting him down. There were moments of triumph, though, fleeting as they were. At local competitions, I'd watch the faces of other parents light up with amazement as I outpaced their children or executed moves with a precision that seemed almost unnatural for my age. My father would stand off to the side, arms crossed, a faint smile breaking his otherwise stoic expression. But success came with its own pressures. Winning wasn't just a validation. It became an expectation. As I rose through the ranks of local tournaments, the spotlight grew brighter. Coaches and organizers began to take notice of me, murmuring about my potential and dropping hints about opportunities one couldn't yet comprehend. With every victory, my father's expectations climbed higher, and my self-imposed standards followed suit. It wasn't all misery and sacrifice, though. My mother remained a steady presence, softening the edges of my father's harsh demands. She knew when to intervene, offering small comforts that made the grind more bearable. She'd pack my favorite snacks for tournaments, or quietly tell me I didn't have to run that extra lap if I was truly too tired. Yet even she couldn't shield me from the pressure completely. I often saw the worry in her eyes, a look that said she wasn't sure if all of this was worth it. Looking back, I think my father saw that same worry but chose to ignore it. To him, discomfort and doubt were necessary hurdles on the road to greatness. He had overcome them in his youth, and he believed I could do the same. It wasn't that he lacked empathy. It was that his empathy was overshadowed by his unwavering belief in discipline and sacrifice. As I approached my 9th birthday, the fruits of our labor became undeniable. I was winning regularly, not just at local competitions but at regional ones as well. My name began to carry weight in the circles where young athletes were scouted and groomed for bigger things. Strangers would approach my father after matches, offering compliments and advice, their voices tinged with the same awe and expectation I had come to both crave and resent. But alongside the victories came the cracks in the foundation. I didn't realize it then, but the relentless grind was beginning to take a toll. It wasn't physical, not yet, but mental. The joy I had once felt on the field or the track was fading, replaced by a sense of obligation. I didn't compete because I loved it anymore. I competed because I had to. The difference was subtle but profound, a quiet shift that would have far-reaching consequences. At the time, I pushed those feelings aside. There was no room for introspection when the next challenge was always looming. I was a machine in motion, built to perform, and machines don't stop to question their purpose. I told myself that this was the price of greatness, and for a while, I believed it. I was 10 when the first cracks in my foundation began to show. It started subtly, a persistent ache in my knees that lingered long after training sessions, a stiffness in my joints that made getting out of bed each morning feel like a monumental task. At first, I brushed it off, telling myself it was nothing more than growing pains. My father echoed the sentiment, reassuring me that this was a natural part of pushing boundaries. Pain means progress, he would say, his tone more instructional than comforting. So, I endured. After all, hadn't my entire life been built around enduring? But as the months went on, the pain became harder to ignore. It wasn't just an ache anymore. It was a sharp, biting sensation that flared with every stride, every jump, every landing. My performance began to suffer. I could feel it during drills, where my movements felt slower, less precise. During competitions, the sharp edges of my confidence dulled as I fought not just my opponents, but also my own body. And yet, I kept quiet. Admitting weakness felt like betrayal, not just of my father's trust, but of the promise I had made to myself. The first time I faltered publicly was during a regional final. I remember the exact moment. I had been leading for most of the match, my opponent struggling to keep up with my pace. But then, as I pivoted sharply to counter his move, a stabbing pain shot through my knee, so intense it nearly buckled beneath me. I recovered quickly enough to finish the match, but the damage was done. Though I managed to secure the win, I knew something was wrong. And judging by the concern etched into my father's face as he watched from the sidelines, so did he. That evening, for the first time, my father suggested we see a specialist. It wasn't a question, but a statement of necessity. The next day, I found myself in a sterile examination room, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead doing little to calm my nerves. The doctor, a no-nonsense professional with decades of experience, ran a series of tests and scans. His diagnosis was swift and unyielding. Early signs of overuse injuries. My young body, he explained, was being subjected to stresses it wasn't fully equipped to handle. The recommendation was clear. I needed to rest. Weeks, possibly months, of reduced training and physical therapy to allow my body to recover. The words felt like a death sentence. Rest? The idea was inconceivable. How could I rest when the next tournament loomed just weeks away? How could I stop when the competition was always advancing, waiting for me to falter so they could take my place? My father's reaction was measured, but I could see the conflict in his eyes. He didn't argue with the doctor, but his silence spoke volumes. To him, rest was the enemy of progress, a step backward in a world that demanded constant forward motion. That night, as we drove home, he finally broke the silence. "We'll follow the doctor's advice," he said, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "But this doesn't mean we stop. We'll adapt." And adapt we did. My physical training was replaced with mental exercises, hours spent studying tactics and visualizing matches. My father introduced me to upper body strength work, carefully designed to avoid putting strain on my knees. It was a compromise, one that allowed me to feel like I was still progressing even as I battled the gnawing frustration of not being on the field. But the rest didn't come easy. For someone who had spent their entire life moving, the stillness felt suffocating. I spent hours staring out my bedroom window, watching neighborhood kids run and play, their laughter a sharp reminder of everything I was missing. Even at school, I felt out of place. The other kids, once merely acquaintances, now seemed like strangers. They couldn't understand what I was going through, and I didn't know how to explain it. As the weeks turned into months, I began to feel the weight of isolation. My father's support was steadfast but practical, focused on solutions rather than emotional comfort. My mother tried to fill the gap, her quiet words of encouragement offering some solace. But even she couldn't fully bridge the divide. I was caught in a liminal space, too injured to compete but too driven to stop. The turning point came during a particularly low moment. I had been watching footage of my past matches, trying to remind myself of what I was capable of, when I stumbled across a video of my first major tournament. Watching my younger self move with such ease and confidence felt like a punch to the gut. I barely recognized that boy. In that moment, I realized something had to change. If I couldn't return to the field with the same fire and passion, then all the sacrifices, mine and my family's, would have been for nothing. With renewed determination, I threw myself into recovery. Physical therapy sessions became my new battlegrounds, each exercise a small victory in the war to reclaim my body. The process was slow and frustrating, but progress came in inches, and those inches added up. By the time I was cleared to return to full training, I felt like I had been given a second chance. But the experience had changed me. I was no longer the fearless child who believed in his own invincibility. I had seen the fragility of my body, felt the weight of uncertainty, and though I was back on the field, a part of me remained wary, waiting for the next setback. Little did I know, the challenges were only just beginning. Returning to the field after months of recovery felt like stepping into an entirely new world. My body had healed, but it was no longer the same. The confidence I once had in every movement was replaced by a cautious awareness of my limitations. Each stride, each jump, was accompanied by the whisper of doubt. Would my body hold up this time? My father, ever the strategist, saw this transformation and decided it was time to reimagine my training entirely. Strength and control, he said one evening as we sat reviewing videos of professional athletes. If you can master those, you'll outlast anyone. This marked the beginning of a new chapter in my training, one where brute force was no longer the primary focus. Instead, we shifted to building a foundation of strength, balance, and precision. My father introduced me to exercises designed to stabilize my joints, to make each movement efficient and deliberate. At first, it felt tedious. Instead of sprinting across fields or competing in high-intensity drills, I was lifting weights with controlled motions, balancing on wobble boards, and performing stretches that felt more suited to a yoga studio than an athletic arena. I hated it at first. The competitive fire in me craved action, the adrenaline of matches, the tangible victories that came from outpacing an opponent. But gradually, I began to see the results. My body felt sturdier, my movements more deliberate. I was regaining confidence, not through blind leaps but calculated steps. The changes weren't just physical. For the first time, I was being forced to think about my body as a tool that needed care and maintenance. My father drilled into me the importance of recovery, of listening to the signals my body was sending. It was a lesson I resisted at first. After all, I had been taught to push through pain, to see it as a sign of progress. But now, I began to understand that progress didn't have to come at the cost of longevity. At school, the shift in my training regimen brought a surprising side effect. My peers, who had once seen me as an untouchable figure of athletic prowess, started to view me differently. The injuries had humanized me, made me more approachable. Kids who had never spoken to me before started asking questions about my training, my recovery. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of connection that wasn't tied to competition. It was a small but meaningful shift, one that gave me a glimpse of a world beyond the single-minded pursuit of victory. The new training program also brought us into contact with a wider network of professionals. My father, though brilliant in his methods, recognized that we needed specialized expertise to navigate this new phase. We began working with a physiotherapist who introduced me to techniques that were as innovative as they were challenging. Resistance bands, eccentric exercises, and something called proprioception, a word I could barely pronounce at first but would come to respect deeply. These sessions became a cornerstone of my routine, teaching me not just how to move but how to move wisely. As the months passed, I began to see the fruits of this labor. I returned to competition cautiously at first, dipping my toes into smaller tournaments to test my readiness. To my surprise, I found that the new approach had not only restored my abilities but enhanced them. My movements were sharper, my stamina greater. Opponents who had once pushed me to my limits now struggled to keep up. I was beginning to feel like my old self again, but with a newfound appreciation for the fragility of the human body. The turning point came during a regional championship. It was my first major competition since returning to the field, and the stakes were high. My father's voice echoed in my mind as I stepped onto the track, strength and control. The match was grueling, each point a test of endurance and strategy. But for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I wasn't fighting against my own body. I was in sync with it, each movement deliberate, each step purposeful. When the final whistle blew and my hand was raised in victory, the roar of the crowd felt like a long overdue vindication. The victory wasn't just mine. It belonged to my father, to my mother, to the physiotherapist who had guided me through the dark days of recovery. It was proof that the sacrifices, the setbacks, the endless hours of effort had all been worth it. But more than that, it was a reminder that my journey was far from over. The challenges I had faced were just the beginning, a prelude to the trials that would shape the athlete and person I was destined to become. As we drove home that evening, the trophy resting on my lap, my father broke his usual silence. "This is good," he said, his tone uncharacteristically soft. "But remember, there's always more to do." He was right, of course. The path to greatness is never a straight line. It's a series of peaks and valleys, each one demanding more than the last. But for the first time, I felt ready to face whatever lay ahead, armed with the lessons I had learned and the strength I had built. By the time I turned 15, the changes in my training and mindset had transformed me. My body felt stronger than it ever had, and the cautious optimism that had defined my return to competition was replaced by a quiet confidence. Each tournament reinforced my progress, and with every victory, the whispers about my potential grew louder. This was a crucial stage in my development. My father, recognizing the balance between pushing my limits and preserving my longevity, continued to refine my training. He focused on the importance of versatility and mental toughness, drilling into me the idea that an adaptable athlete could withstand anything. The tournaments I participated in during this period were not just opportunities to showcase my skills, but also to identify areas for improvement. My father often said, "Winning's good, but learning is better." A philosophy that felt counterintuitive at times, but ultimately shaped how I approached every match. Despite the grueling schedule, I began to find moments of joy in my craft again. There were matches where I moved with such precision and confidence that it felt almost effortless. I started to appreciate the intricate dance of strategy and execution, the way preparation and instinct merged to create something remarkable. These victories, however, didn't come without setbacks. There were still moments when doubt crept in, when a missed opportunity or a tough opponent left me questioning my readiness for the challenges ahead. But those moments didn't derail me. If anything, they fueled my determination to improve. My father's role during this time shifted slightly. While he remained my most steadfast supporter and coach, he also began encouraging me to take more responsibility for my own progress. "You're not a kid anymore," he said one evening after a particularly tough training session. "If you want this, you have to own it." His words resonated with me. For years, I had relied on his guidance, trusting him to shape my path. But now, I realized that my success would ultimately depend on my own choices, my own effort. This realization was both liberating and daunting. I embraced it, though, channeling it into every drill, every match, every step forward. By the time I reached the end of my 15th year, I felt like a different person, not just physically stronger but mentally sharper. My foundation had been rebuilt, not on blind ambition but on resilience, adaptability, and an unwavering commitment to my goals. The next phase of my journey was approaching, and I was ready to face it head-on. The year that followed was the most intense and transformative of my life. At 16, I committed myself to a level of effort that surpassed anything I had ever known. Each day was a test, a challenge to push harder, think smarter, and grow tougher, not just physically but mentally. The boy I had been at the beginning of my journey, eager but unsure, began to fade away, replaced by someone more focused and resolute. The routine was relentless. Mornings began before dawn, with endurance runs that tested my stamina and sharpened my focus. Afternoons were consumed by strength training, drills, and scrimmages that honed my precision. Evenings were reserved for recovery, stretching, ice baths, and reviewing footage of my matches to dissect every detail. I became obsessed with improvement, studying the movements of elite athletes, mimicking their techniques, and incorporating their strategies into my own game. What struck me most about this year wasn't just how much my skills improved, but how deeply my personality evolved. The fire inside me, once a scattered energy, became a disciplined flame. I learned to embrace discomfort, to see every challenge as an opportunity to grow. Failure, which had once filled me with dread, became a teacher. I started to welcome mistakes, knowing they held the secrets to my progress. My father noticed the change. He had always been a driving force in my life, but now our dynamic began to shift. Instead of constantly instructing me, he started stepping back, giving me the space to take ownership of my growth. "You're leading yourself now," he said one day, his voice tinged with a mix of pride and recognition. It wasn't just my game that was changing. It was my entire approach to life. This transformation extended beyond the field. At school, I found myself more confident and assertive. I began speaking up in class, taking on leadership roles in group projects, and building relationships that had once felt out of reach. My peers, who had previously viewed me as distant or overly focused, started to see me in a new light. I wasn't just the athlete anymore. I was someone with depth and determination. But the intensity of my focus also came with sacrifices. Social events, casual outings, even small moments of relaxation became rare luxuries. I had friends, but my world revolved around my goals. There were nights when the weight of my commitments felt crushing, when the thought of another early morning run or another grueling practice made me question if it was all worth it. In those moments, I relied on the vision of my future, the image of what I was working toward, to pull me through. One of the most pivotal moments of that year came during a regional championship match. It was against an opponent who had beaten me decisively 2 years earlier, someone whose name still carried a sting of humiliation. As I stepped onto the field, I felt the familiar tension of competition, but this time, something was different. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't overthinking. I was present, fully immersed in the moment. Every movement felt deliberate, every decision calculated. When the final whistle blew and I emerged victorious, I didn't just feel triumphant. I felt transformed. That victory wasn't just a win on the scoreboard. It was proof of how far I had come. By the end of that year, I was no longer defined by potential or recovery. I had become someone who earned their success through grit and relentless effort. My father once told me that greatness wasn't about never falling. It was about getting up stronger every time you did. Looking back on that year, I realized he was right. I was no longer chasing someone else's dream or living under the weight of expectations. I was carving my own path, one hard-fought step at a time. By 17, I had reached a point where the weight of my efforts began to draw attention from outside the tight circle of my training and competitions. That year, I participated in a national-level tournament, a gathering of some of the brightest talents in the country. The stakes were higher than anything I had faced before, and the pressure was immense, but I had learned to thrive in that environment. Every match was a test of everything I'd worked for: strength, strategy, resilience, and control. It was during one of the later matches of the tournament, an intense semifinal that pushed me to the edge of my abilities, that a new chapter in my life began. I didn't notice him at first, a man sitting quietly among the coaches and families, his eyes fixed on every move I made. But by the time the match ended, and I emerged victorious, his presence became impossible to ignore. He didn't clap or cheer like the rest of the crowd. Instead, he nodded subtly, a gesture that felt heavier than any applause. After the tournament ended, as I packed up my gear, he approached. He introduced himself as a scout for a professional team, one known for nurturing young athletes and helping them transition into elite competition. He had been following my progress, he explained, and this tournament had confirmed what he had suspected. I had the potential to compete at a higher level. His words weren't flowery or overblown, but they carried weight. He spoke about discipline and focus, about how talent alone wasn't enough to succeed at the professional level. Then he extended an offer, an invitation to join his team when I turned 18, provided I maintained my trajectory and continued to refine my skills. I remember standing there, stunned. As his words sank in, this was it, the moment I had been working toward for years. And yet, it didn't feel like the culmination of a dream. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something even greater. When I told my father later that evening, his reaction was subdued but unmistakably proud. "It's a step," he said, "but you'll have to earn the next one." From that moment on, my focus sharpened even further. Every practice session felt more meaningful, every match more significant. The Scouts' promise wasn't just an opportunity, it was a challenge. I wasn't just working to prove myself anymore. I was working to meet and exceed expectations, to show that I belonged among the best. The remaining months of that year were a blur of preparation. My father brought in specialists to help refine the finer aspects of my technique, from speed work to tactical decision-making. I studied videos of professional athletes, analyzing their movements and strategies, and adapted elements of their game to my own. The progress was incremental but undeniable. Each tournament I entered felt like another rung on the ladder, another step closer to the life I had envisioned for myself. By the time my 18th birthday approached, I was ready. The Scouts' promise had transformed from a distant possibility into a concrete goal, and I had done everything in my power to seize it. I knew the path ahead would only get harder, the competition fiercer, but I felt prepared. The years of sacrifice, discipline, and relentless effort had forged me into someone who didn't just dream of success. I demanded it of myself. When I finally stepped into the professional team's training facility, it felt like crossing into another world. The pristine grounds, the state-of-the-art equipment, and the sheer intensity of the atmosphere were overwhelming at first. Everything about it screamed excellence, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of doubt. Was I truly ready to compete at this level? But as I stood there, taking in the sights and sounds, I reminded myself of everything I had overcome to get here. The long hours of training, the sacrifices, the injuries, all of it had been preparation for this moment. Doubt was a luxury I couldn't afford, and so I pushed it aside and focused on the task at hand. The first few weeks were brutal. The competition was fiercer than anything I had experienced before. Every player on the team was exceptional, and the pace of training sessions was relentless. Mistakes that might have gone unnoticed in smaller tournaments were immediately called out here. I quickly realized that this wasn't just a step up in skill level, it was a different game entirely. My father's advice rang in my ears during those early days: adapt and then dominate. I threw myself into every practice, every drill, determined to prove that I belonged. The physical demands were immense, but it was the mental aspect that truly tested me. I had to learn to handle criticism without losing confidence, to analyze my own performance with ruthless honesty, and to absorb lessons from every mistake. The coaches were tough but fair, and I began to see their critiques as opportunities rather than setbacks. They weren't trying to tear me down. They were shaping me into a player who could handle the pressure of professional competition. Slowly but surely, I began to find my footing. My movements became sharper, my decisions faster, my confidence steadier. Off the field, I was learning just as much. Living away from home for the first time was a challenge in itself. I had to navigate the complexities of balancing intense training with the responsibilities of adulthood. Cooking, managing finances, and finding time to rest were all new experiences, and I stumbled more than once. But with every misstep, I grew more independent, more capable. The turning point came during a scrimmage against a rival team. It was my first chance to prove myself in a real match setting, and the stakes felt impossibly high. The game was fast and aggressive, and I found myself struggling to keep up in the first half. But as the match wore on, something clicked. I stopped overthinking every move and started playing with the instinct and precision that had gotten me here in the first place. By the end of the game, I had not only held my own but made a critical play that secured the win for our side. That scrimmage marked the beginning of a shift. My teammates, who had been cautious and even skeptical of me at first, started to see me as one of them. The coaches, too, began to push me harder, recognizing that I was ready to take on more responsibility. Each day felt like a small victory, a step closer to becoming the player I knew I could be. As the season progressed, I started earning more time on the field. My role was still limited, but every opportunity was a chance to prove myself. I played with a sense of urgency, knowing that every moment counted. The scouts' promise had brought me here, but it was up to me to stay. By the end of my first year with the team, I had established myself as a rising talent. I wasn't the star yet, but I was no longer just a prospect. I had earned my place, and I knew that the path ahead was mine to shape. The dream that had driven me for so long was no longer just a dream. It was my reality, and I was ready for whatever came next. My second year with the team was nothing short of transformative. The grind of professional competition had tempered me, forging a stronger, more resilient version of myself. Every practice, every match, every critique had honed my skills to a level I once only dreamed of. But even as I grew into my role within the team, a new aspiration began to take root in my mind, representing my country on the national stage. The idea wasn't new. It had been a distant goal for as long as I could remember, but it had always felt out of reach, a dream reserved for the best of the best. Yet, as my performances continued to improve, whispers of a potential call-up began to circulate. My coaches, once cautious with their praise, began dropping hints. "Keep playing like this," they'd say, "and you might get the call." The defining moment came during a high-profile match against one of the league's top teams. The stakes were enormous, and the intensity of the game was like nothing I had experienced before. Every play demanded precision, every decision carried weight. But instead of faltering under the pressure, I thrived. I made key plays, outmaneuvered opponents, and delivered a performance that left no doubt about my abilities. By the time the final whistle blew, I had not only helped secure a crucial win, but also caught the attention of those watching from afar. A week later, the call came. I was in the middle of a recovery session when my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end introduced themselves as part of the national team selection committee. They wanted me to join the upcoming training camp, a chance to prove myself among the best players in the country. I was stunned. The words felt surreal, almost too good to be true. For a moment, I just stood there, phone pressed to my ear, as the weight of the opportunity sank in. This was it, the culmination of years of sacrifice, pain, and relentless effort. I thanked them, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside me, and hung up. Then I called my father. His reaction was everything I expected, calm, measured, but with a depth of pride that didn't need words. "This is what we worked for," he said. "Now it's up to you to show them why you belong." The weeks leading up to the camp were a whirlwind of preparation. I trained harder than ever, fine-tuning every aspect of my game. But there was a new element to my mindset now, a sense of belonging. This wasn't just a dream anymore. It was my reality, and I was determined to make the most of it. The camp itself was grueling. The level of competition was unlike anything I had faced before. These were players who had dominated their leagues, athletes with years of experience and accolades to their names. But instead of feeling intimidated, I felt inspired. Every session was a chance to learn, to grow, to prove that I deserved to be there. The coaches pushed us to our limits, demanding excellence in every drill, every scrimmage. And while there were moments of doubt, times when I questioned if I could keep up, I always found a way to rise to the challenge. By the end of the camp, I had done more than hold my own. I had made an impression. When the final roster for the national team was announced, I waited with bated breath, the tension almost unbearable. And then I saw my name. In that moment, all the struggles, the setbacks, the sacrifices, they all felt worth it. I was no longer just a kid chasing a dream. I was a national team player, ready to represent my country on the biggest stage. As I stood there, holding the letter of confirmation, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. It wasn't just my achievement, it was my father's, my mother's, my coaches, and everyone who had believed in me along the way. And while I knew the road ahead would be even tougher, I felt ready. This was my moment, and I was determined to make it count. The first time I stepped onto the field wearing my country's colors, I felt an overwhelming mix of pride and pressure. The Olympic Games were the ultimate stage, a place where the best athletes in the world came to compete, to test their limits, and to leave their mark on history. As I stood among my teammates, the roar of the crowd reverberating through the stadium, I couldn't help but think back to the long road that had brought me here. The competition was fierce, as expected. Every match was a battle of skill, strategy, and endurance. But there was something different about competing at this level. It wasn't just about personal glory anymore. It was about representing something much bigger than myself. Each time I stepped onto the field, I carried the weight of my team, my family, and my country. It was both daunting and exhilarating. My father's lessons echoed in my mind throughout the tournament. Strength and control, he had said so many times. Those words became my mantra, grounding me when the stakes felt insurmountable. Whether it was executing a crucial play or recovering from a mistake, I relied on the foundation we had built together over the years. The final match of the tournament was unlike anything I had ever experienced. The atmosphere was electric, the stakes higher than ever. As the game unfolded, every moment felt charged with significance. The tension was palpable, each play met with cheers and gasps from the crowd. By the time the final whistle blew, the exhaustion in my body was outweighed only by the elation in my heart. We had done it. We had secured victory, a moment that would live on in the memories of everyone who watched. Standing on the podium, the weight of the gold medal around my neck, I felt a profound sense of fulfillment. This wasn't just a culmination of my efforts. It was the embodiment of every sacrifice, every setback, and every triumph along the way. My father's face in the crowd caught my eye, his expression a mixture of pride and quiet satisfaction. For all his strictness and unrelenting expectations, I knew this moment meant as much to him as it did to me. But as much as this felt like the pinnacle, I knew it wasn't the end. The journey of an athlete is never truly over. There would always be new challenges, new goals, new heights to reach. The Olympic victory was a milestone, a testament to what was possible when hard work and determination converged. Yet, it was also a reminder of the path that still lay ahead. As the national anthem played and the crowd erupted in applause, I made a silent promise to myself. This wasn't the peak of my story. It was a chapter, one that I would cherish forever, but also one that would inspire me to keep striving. The boy who had once struggled to find his footing, who had doubted his worth, had grown into an athlete who could stand among the best in the world. And yet, I knew the best was still to come. The road to greatness is never straight or smooth. It's a winding, unpredictable journey filled with obstacles and opportunities. But as I stood there, surrounded by my team, my family, and the deafening cheers of the crowd, I felt ready for whatever came next. The climb had been steep, but the view was worth it. And now, with the world at my feet, I was eager to see how much further I could go.